There we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Angela Evans. I am the labor cohort manager at SJN, and I'm really happy today to be organizing this webinar with Ashton Lattimore from Prism Reports. Prism is a nonprofit newsroom run by people of color, and they are part of our labor cohort, which has been a year-long effort by SJN to help and support newsrooms looking at worker-led solutions. And it also includes a fellowship. So Ashton here is one of our fellows, and she has been looking at the 4-day work week and how she basically at Prism as editor-in-chief has helped integrate some of these worker-led solutions into her own work environment. And so we're really happy to have her. Ashton, why don't you take it away? Real quick, if you all have questions, there is a Q&A channel. There's also a chat function. I'll be monitoring that and bringing things up to Ashton as it works. So thanks, Ashton. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks, Angela, and thanks everyone for being here. I'm very excited to come and talk with everyone about not just the 4-day work week, of which I am a huge evangelist at this point, but more broadly, how you can use journalism and specifically solutions journalism to kind of seed pro-worker solutions into our own workplaces. As Angela mentioned, I'm the editor-in-chief of Prism. We are a relatively new organization. We were established in 2019, so we're just under 4 years old at this point. And we're independent nonprofit newsroom led by journalists of color, producing journalism for communities of color and other marginalized communities with the intent to disrupt harmful narratives and to inform movements for justice. One of the primary movements that our work informs and covers is the workers' rights movement, labor. So a lot of our coverage focuses on issues surrounding workers of color, low-income workers, immigrant workers, incarcerated workers, workplace issues like discrimination and toxic work environments, safety and worker protections, wage fairness like the minimum wage and pay gaps, and also worker-led organizing, which often looks like unions, but can also come in many different other forms through which workers can wield power and wield influence to make their workplaces better and safer for themselves. So we have a number of journalistic approaches, all of which come into play on our labor coverage. One is just straight up news coverage. So that's kind of daily, weekly, ongoing stories on issues that develop over time. So that might look like covering some of the unionization pushes that are happening in retail, for example, right now. We have deep dive investigations that might look at a single workplace or a single issue. And those are built on long-term deep reporting with trusted sources, documents. Of course, the marquee one here today is solutions journalism. So of course that has the 4 pillars, which I'll say them, but I think most of the people here probably know them already. But solutions journalism covers a response to a social problem, evidence of how it's working, limitations to the solution, and then insight on others, how others can replicate it. And then lastly, we do a fair number of Q&As and as told tos with both workers themselves who want to talk directly about their experiences in their workplaces and work environments, or worker advocates and organizers who want to talk about the work that they're doing in a more kind of conversational format. So here are some examples of solution stories that we've done in the past couple of years. We've been covering workers' rights since 2020. So, and as part of the labor cohort, we've amped up our solutions coverage, particularly of workers' rights within the last year. So we've covered worker co-ops in the field of therapy. We've covered ban the box legislation and how that reduces barriers for formerly incarcerated people. We've covered unions, particularly how they're working in the higher education space. And we've also covered migrant-led labor organizing, which is often a space where unionization isn't necessarily possible, but workers have found other kind of creative solutions to exercise their collective bargaining power. So what I want to start us off with today is a case study. Really what this webinar is about is how you can create ways within your own newsrooms and your own workplaces for the reporting that you're doing on labor, on workplace issues to impact your own workplace experience. And the reason why this is structured the way that it is because that's exactly what happened at Prism. Basically, as you see here, on May 18th of last spring, so a little less than a year ago, we published a piece on how the 4-day work week is kind of gaining momentum around the world. I'm sure you've seen a lot of social media discourse about it. There's been a fair bit of news coverage pushing for a 4-day work week as sort of a natural evolution of increased worker productivity. The 5-day work week has been around for 100 years or more at this point. So I think there was an assumption for much of the 20th century that as technology improved and it became more easy and efficient for people to get things done at work, then we simply wouldn't need to spend as much time there. But by and large, that hasn't happened until recent years, when people have really started examining more closely what our work lives look like and how much time we do actually need to spend at work. So our story touched on that. And then you'll see September 15th, so about 4 months later, we adopted a 4-day work week ourselves as a newsroom. And I think one of the few newsrooms who's made that shift. The only other one that I know off the top of my head is Yes Magazine. So the backstory to how this change came about has a couple of kind of key components. First is that in summer 2020, so right after the onset of the coronavirus pandemic, we experimented with a 4-day work week just for the summer at Prism. The way we did that was with staggered work schedules. So some of us were on Monday through Thursday, and some of us were on Tuesday through Friday. And we did it that way to try to ensure just sort of news coverage around for the entire week and making sure somebody was available on every working day. After that, just kind of the way some people do summer Fridays, or some workplaces do summer Fridays. That was sort of a short-lived experiment. I think we had a few snags with it. I think just kind of having people on different schedules, we found was not as restful as we might have expected. So it was sort of a one summer experiment, and that was done. But afterward, in the interest of continuing to kind of support people in work-life balance and creating more time and space for people to be away from work, we did implement permanently half-day Fridays, and that just became our status quo. So we had a 36-hour work week where people worked 8 hours Monday through Thursday, and then on Friday you worked 4 hours, and really it's whatever 4 hours you want. Part of the reason I think we're able to do that is just because we're a fully remote workplace. There are some of us in all around the country, really. So people who are in California, I'm based in Philadelphia, there are folks in New York, North Carolina, and so on. So it really wasn't a question of when people are coming into the office so much as when people just need to be logged on and kind of getting their work done. And that was our status quo for quite a long time, and it worked really well for us, and it kind of gave people some breathing room that I think all of us really learned to cherish and learn to look forward to, and became part of our established rhythm. So that's kind of the background conditions work-wise that were happening that allowed us to eventually make this shift. The other piece of things, which I think is equally important, is that Prism's actually been reporting on workers' rights since 2020. So that includes the workplace experiences of journalists in a lot of different cases, including freelance journalists, and how there might be a space for organizing among freelance journalists, how the COVID-19 pandemic affected immigrant journalists who are on visas, and the experience of many women journalists who deal with harassment and threats within their workplace. So we had kind of a pre-existing space where discourse about workers' rights and workplace conditions was something that was already in our bloodstream, because we were doing a steady stream of reporting on workers' rights almost pretty much since we were founded. And then sort of the other baseline operational piece of things is that from the beginning, just as a workplace culture, we've been very focused on work-life balance, mental health, and supporting staff as whole people. I think, as many folks know, Prism staff is majority people of color, majority women and other gender diverse folks, LGBTQ folks as well. So many of us really feel acutely the impact of reporting daily on the issues that are impacting our communities and impacting us. So we felt it was really important to create kind of a workplace where people's humanity was centered as well as their productivity. So the ultimate catalyst for us to jump into a 4-day work week was this reporting. So it was a story by Montse Reyes, and it was just a story about how, the 4-day work week is kind of gaining momentum. As I note here, this was actually a solution story that came in as part of our labor cohort work, and really looking at the 4-day work week as a response to a social problem. And the social problem was really the ways that I think the pandemic kind of laid bare the overwork, the burnout that people were experiencing in their jobs. This was at the height of the Great Resignation discourse. So there was a lot of talk about how workplaces could be made better, simply kind of stem the bleeding from people quitting their jobs in search of better opportunities or more balanced opportunities. The story looked at the evidence for how a 4-day work week was working. And it cited a study from New Zealand where some companies had adopted the 4-day work week and found a 20% increase in productivity, even with one full day less of work. And of course, employees saved time and money on their commute. There were improvements to their mental health. There were reduced barriers for employees with caregiving responsibilities, which we know fall disproportionately on women and people of color. The story also kind of acknowledged some of the limitations of the 4-day work week as a viable workplace solution. Many of the companies who have tried it around the world, and even that we're seeing in the United States, many of these companies are in tech or finance or other traditionally kind of white collar industries. So far, I will concede it does not seem terribly popular in the media space either, but I'm hoping that that's something that will change. And that there's also a risk of where people reduce their hours below 40 hours a week due to different state laws or employee policies, if there's a risk of impacting their benefits or their access to things like healthcare. So that's something that you kind of need to be aware of as we explore the possibility of implementing something like a 4-day work week. Are there going to be follow-on concerns? And lastly, the story got into some insights, which is, the fourth pillar of solutions journalism, including that one of the companies who adopted a 4-day work week did so by adopting it gradually. So they analyzed their Friday workloads to maintain their output with fewer hours. They started with no meeting Fridays, where employees didn't schedule any meetings internally or externally, then half-day Fridays, and now a 4-day work week. So the next step in the process for us adopting a 4-day work week was really making sure that Prism's leadership noticed the story. So as editor-in-chief and our chief operating officer, Caitlin Gaffin, we don't necessarily read every story that gets published throughout the week. And even if we do, we're not necessarily reading it with an eye toward, oh, how can we kind of adopt this thing into our radar or into our workplace. But I think it's crucial if something like this is going to work and it's going to bubble up from reporting, there has to be some kind of pipeline for the stories to get in front of the people who have decision-making authority. For us, that's just an RSS feed, literally within our Slack, where every single story that gets published just gets spit into the latest stories channel, where someone can go and just kind of check out what's going on the site if they don't want to check the homepage. And this happens to be how Caitlin, who was our COO, found this story and read it and kind of got the idea that maybe this is something that Prism should try. We'll just pause here just to say, if there are questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and Angela will kind of alert me, or you can put them in the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. But yes, feel free if you have questions or thoughts for discussion, just jump in at any time. So what we decided to do to experiment with the idea of a 4-day work week was to do a pilot. So rather than jumping right into making this a permanent shift, we created this pilot to test it out so we could make a more informed decision once we had more data on how it was actually going to affect people, whether it was going to do what we hoped it did as a solution, which was increase people's mental health, increase people's time and space for other aspects of their lives, and allow us to continue producing the kind of journalism that it's important to us to produce, and at what we think of as a kind of a reasonable cadence for kind of the audience goals and the coverage goals that we have. So we decided on a finite length of time. We decided on 12 weeks. If I had this to do over again, it's possible I might make it a longer period of time, only because those 12 weeks were over the summer, which is kind of notoriously quiet, or usually is notoriously quiet for news. This summer happened to not be, because it was the summer that the Dobbs decision came down from the Supreme Court. So not quiet at all, but 12 weeks. We decided in advance how we would measure success. So we would look at hard metrics in terms of how many stories did we publish during this time period, what were our audience numbers and our traffic, What did our social engagement look like? How many visitors were there to the site? In addition to the kind of soft metrics that we more expected to improve with something like a 4-day work week, like work-life balance and mental health. We also decided in advance how we were going to measure these metrics. So we have our kind of standard audience metrics tools like Parsley. Some newsrooms use Chartbeat. Publishing stats on WordPress, social media engagement metrics. And then at the end of the pilot, we sent around a survey to staff. And this was a qualitative survey, basically asking them what the impact of this pilot had been on their mental health, on their productivity, work-life balance. And we also gave space for narrative answers on any challenges that they faced as a result of the shift to a 4-day work week, any benefits, and then a yes/no question on whether they recommended that we make this a permanent change, and anything else that leadership could do to support the adjustment to a 4-day work week. Lastly, we reported out on what we found as a result of the pilot, and that's where this final story came from, and the ultimate decision to adopt it. The pilot was a resounding success. The team, perhaps unsurprisingly, unanimously recommended following through, but the final decision ultimately rested with the leadership team, with me in particular. Even as successful as it was, I think something that surprised me was the need to work through some resistance from places where you might not expect it, including from myself. I think a lot of us, just as people who've been working for many years, people who've been part of kind of a capitalist system, this can particularly impact people in leadership, have sort of internalized a lot of ideas about productivity and how will it look if we decide to make this kind of shift. I was acutely aware of kind of stereotypes about people of color and, what will it look like if we decide to work less? So really learning to kind of sit with those uncomfortable feelings and find a way forward to make a decision that was best for my team and the organization was a bit of a process. And I think the reporting out piece of things, where you could really look at the hard evidence that we kind of assembled through those metrics and measurements of success, was really useful for that part of it. So I think of reporting out as part of being accountable, both to staff, board members, funders, your audience, and to yourself. And think about the function of reporting out. Like, are you asking for permission when you're telling people that this is what you're doing? Are you informing them after a decision has been made? In our case, we didn't need anyone's permission to do this, so we simply made the decision and decided to inform people after we had done so, but aimed to do so in a really persuasive way that made the case for why we had done this and made the case for why it was something that other newsrooms should explore, which is why this story eventually became a solution story in and of itself. So the way that we published this report out was to kind of document the problem that we were responding to with a 4-day work week, including the corrosive 24-hour news cycle, burnout among journalists, which is increasing mid COVID-19, and just particularly the impact of kind of the day-to-day churn on journalists of color and LGBTQ folks who are reporting on, in many ways, our own oppression and marginalization, as well as our own organizing and response to it. The story included insight into the ways that we structured our pilot so that we could offer kind of a path forward for people who wanted to try this themselves. So we decided to share how we structured the pilot. In this case, we did actually keep everyone on the same Monday through Thursday schedule. We actually found it was much more, I think, effective and restful to just have everyone on the same days and everyone off on the same days, because I think what you find can happen is if there are some people who are still on Friday, there's kind of spillover work that can end up kind of coming into the inboxes or the Slack channels of people who are supposed to be off, and it just ends up feeling not quite like a real weekend, which is the way that you want it to feel. We also needed to adapt our workflows to cover major things that happened during this period of time, including the Dobbs decision, which meant that sometimes people had to work late and find other ways and other times to step away from work to kind of regain and reclaim that time. And also the final thing that was really important to us ethically was ensuring that our editors were reachable so that they could address any corrections or urgent matters that arose on Fridays, because we do still publish stories on Fridays. They're scheduled in advance, but we do still publish. It just happens that we are not around. And this piece, in the interest of transparency and reporting out, marshaled the evidence. So talked about the results of the survey and what staff members had to say about their work-life balance and productivity. And then we also talked about kind of the hard numbers, which meant that we were still hitting our editorial production goals, publishing 8 stories a week. Our audience growth goals, actually doubling them in one case, and our social media channels were continuing to be on an upward trajectory. So really, the evidence showed that we gained quite a lot by making this shift and lost basically nothing. So there really wasn't any great reason not to go forward with it. That said, it was important for me to kind of name some of the limitations that made it challenging, or that might make this challenging for other newsrooms to adopt it. It has been a little bit harder to kind of collaborate across teams with fewer days available for meetings. That means it's also a little harder to coordinate meeting schedules with external partners, and sometimes, feeling the need to work late. And then there's kind of the limitation where it's hard to imagine how something like a 4-day work week would work in a newsroom that is very much sort of wedded to the 24-hour news cycle. So if you're kind of expecting people to do round-the-clock news coverage because that's what your audience has been conditioned to expect from you, and that's part of what your mission is, this might be kind of a tougher shift than at a place like Prism, where we have a much less sort of breaking news approach to the work that we're doing.
Ashton, can I ask you a question real quick?
Yes.
Thank you. That was awesome. And I love how you applied the 4 pillars of solutions journalism to your own policy. You mentioned when you were trying to decide, whether or not to adopt it, some of the kind of those external factors that you were thinking through, including a response from community, both maybe positive or negative. Can you kind of go into what the response was from either your readers or outside of your readership, and how you dealt with that?
It's been overwhelmingly positive, shockingly overwhelmingly positive. Very, very supportive. Our reader community is extremely supportive. A lot of our supporters, and that includes sort of foundations who are supporting us with funding and in other ways, and our partners have really just been very kind, very supportive, and very interested, which I think is the part that I didn't necessarily expect to see, but that there's a great deal of just interest. Like, how did you do this? Could this be something that I could do in my own workplace? And will you talk to me about it? So I think that's really been very heartening to see, and really kind of drives home for me this idea that making kind of radical changes that are pro-worker, that are done with employees in mind, even if it's something that feels a little taboo and sort of corporate kind of culture, often that's not really where Prism is playing for the most part anyway. So we need to feel more empowered to make those kinds of decisions. And I think their response to this has really kind of kicked that up a notch for us to help us feel kind of empowered to do what's right for ourselves, and also kind of set an example when we can.
Thanks.
Yeah. So that's the case study. So that's kind of how we did it, right? And I'll shift in a moment into kind of how this maps on to other workplace issues and how people can kind of use solutions journalism and other journalism to make these kinds of changes within their own newsrooms. But just to kind of ground us in those workplace issues, I would love if people want to drop in the chat or just come off of mute and just kind of seed some ideas about what some of the major workplace challenges facing newsrooms and journalists are at this moment. I'd love to get people's thoughts. Yes, lack of resources and capacity. Thank you, Angela. I think that's probably the biggest. Well, is it the biggest one? I think there's pay, there's overwork, there's burnout. I don't know if other folks have thoughts. Yeah, but there are multiple kind of issues that are being covered in other industries that also affect journalists quite quite acutely in many cases. I think burnout being one of the major ones, but also very concrete things like a lack of full-time jobs being available, low pay, and things like that, where we're reporting on these things as if they're happening somewhere outside of us. Yes, lack of benefits, but these are also things that we're actually quite acutely impacted by as journalists. Yes, too much work to do in just one day. Absolutely. So having an understanding of kind of what those background problems are, how can you then bring pro-worker solutions into your own newsroom? So I think starting off, you have to lay the foundations. The key thing to understand, and if you take nothing else away from this entire webinar, remember this one thing, which is that journalists are workers too. We report on workers' rights, we report on labor, but we ourselves, we are labor, we are workers, especially staff and people who are outside of leadership, and some of the same challenges that people are facing, including sort of a lack of empowerment or collective power to bargain or ask for changes or demand benefits, are affecting journalists just as severely as they're affecting workers in other sectors of the economy. So I think making this kind of work, part of that is just understanding this fundamental truth and then shaping your newsroom culture around it. So one thing to think about is really start with your content. Like, how does your content report on labor issues? Consider how that creates the context of workers and labor within your own newsroom. What point of view does your work express about workplace issues? Whose perspectives are centered? My kind of paradigmatic example for something like this is I won't name the newspaper, but there is kind of a large legacy newspaper, actually a couple of them, who's been reporting pretty regularly on the widespread shift to remote work. But for the most part, the primary people who are quoted in those stories are management and often real estate people, like landlords of large downtown city businesses, who are saying, hey, this remote work thing isn't working. It's bad for the economy, with the subtext being, I don't like having to manage people this way, and or I'm concerned that I'm going to lose out on a bunch of lease revenue if all of these companies decide to have people go remote. Whereas I think we all understand, if you start asking actual workers, employees, about how the remote work shift is going for them, you kind of end up with very different answers. So I think what kind of content your newsroom is putting out around questions of workers' rights and labor can kind of give you a clearer sense about what kind of context that you're operating in, because I think there's often a mistaken sense that something like that is objective when it's actually everyone writes from a point of view, and every publication has a point of view or some points of view, and you can often see those points of view come through quite clearly in terms of like what their internal newsroom practices look like. I did not mean to go forward a slide. Oh, okay, I went back. Great. So what you need to do besides that to kind of lay the foundation, you can learn from peer newsrooms. So if you see another newsroom that has made a change that you think would be useful or helpful or even transformative for the way that you work in your newsroom, you can reach out to them and ask them, you know, how did you do that? What happened, or what was the thing that catalyzed that shift, and how did you ultimately make that change? This is something we've done at Prism, and there are a couple of things that we've learned from other newsrooms. One of them is actually we have a pause week every spring, which is just kind of a spring break, essentially, where everyone is off. And that's another practice that I actually learned from MLK 50 because they wrote about it and posted about it and shared about it, and then inspired us to do something as well. You can get educated, you can attend workshops, seminars, and conferences, and bring back your findings to help seed conversations about workers' rights, labor, and workplace issues. And then the last one is probably the biggest one, if we're being honest, is that change has to find support at the top with leadership, with the people who are actually empowered to make decisions and changes. So culture change can often be helped along by strategic hiring at all levels, very intentionally hiring people who you know are open to different ways of working, or just open to the idea of doing something different. The next key element of how to make this work is to create a pipeline. So you have to make sure that there are channels and ways for ideas to make their way from stories and staff to decision makers. You can't assume that HR and operations folks or leadership, executive leadership, are reading every single story, or that they're reading it with kind of the idea in mind of how it maps onto the newsroom as a workplace. So there are a couple of different ways you can make this work. And I think how it works will really depend on the structure and the size of your newsroom. Potential pipelines are just the RSS feed, like I showed earlier. If you don't publish a huge volume of stories, just simply having something that's automated that shoots out the stories as they come live to make sure everybody sees them can be really helpful just for getting different issues on people's radar and seeding them for discussion. At a more individual level, you can just forward stories that you think are interesting to people in leadership, to HR, and say, hey, what do we think about this? Or, hey, is this something we could consider trying in our newsroom? If you're someone who is in leadership or in HR, you might consider creating something like a suggestion box where people can share stories, share ideas, or town halls where people actually are able to speak freely. And lastly, I think one of the most obvious pipelines for something like this is actually a union. The union is going to not only have the power to raise ideas with management, but also will have the power to kind of collectively bargain for the kinds of changes that might be really transformative for workers within a given newsroom. So for many people who are in newsrooms right now who have unions, then that's kind of a place to start, I would say. Something to think about is what your role is within your newsroom and how you can use that positionality to set up a pipeline. So as I said, if you're in leadership or you're in HR, you're in a position where you can be asking, you can be asking people, hey, is there any reporting that's come across your desk or that's come through the newsroom lately that you think is something that we need to think about? If you're a reporter or somebody who is maybe further down the org chart, you might be in a position where you're kind of feeding those things up or starting discussions about them, in the Slack water cooler channel or however it might work in your newsroom.
Ashton, how many people are in your newsroom? And you all aren't in a union, right?
Nope, no union. We're 14, I think, at this point. So fairly small.
And you also use a lot of freelancers. How does this kind of play into how you operate with your freelancers as well?
Yeah, so it's interesting. This was a freelance story that started all of this, the 4-day work week. But yeah, I think because we work with a lot of freelancers, we just end up getting kind of a wide range of perspectives from people who are just situated differently to their work in many different places, which is really helpful. And again, all of the stories, whether they're staff or freelance, come through that same RSS feed channel. So we see all of them. Whether we choose to read each and every one of them is kind of a different question. But all stories kind of get the same pride of place within that potential area for discussion. So it's helpful just that we have so many different perspectives coming in from across the country. Okay, so the next step for how to make this work is to design a pilot. So for new initiatives, you don't have to make a permanent shift all at once. You can kind of give yourself time to test, to learn, and adapt. And there are some things to think about as you craft a pilot. And once again, here are the 4 pillars of solutions journalism. And I keep harping on them because they're actually a very useful way to make sure that you're introducing rigor into your decision-making process. So what problem are you trying to solve? Because a pilot should be a response to a real problem. If you're trying to, I don't know, like bring ponies to the newsroom, that sounds really cool, but like, does that solve a problem that anyone actually has? If not, maybe that's not where you want to design your pilot. Consider what metrics you'll use to evaluate the pilot's success on. What will your evidence of success or failure look like? Make sure you're tracking any snags or challenges along the way and any shifts that you make to meet those challenges so that you're clear on the limitations of your solution and maybe where additional solutions or tweaks might be needed. And then lastly, be transparent with your insights after the fact. So consider publishing a story or a news release so that other newsrooms can benefit from your experience. And then lastly, report it out. Just be accountable to your measures of success, to your stakeholders, and keep them informed. So that means your staff, your board, your funders, your audience, your partners. Make sure people know what's going on and you're bringing them as appropriate into the decision process at the point where they belong in the decision process, whether that's before decision is made or after. Share your experiences, your successes and struggles and your insights. As you craft your kind of report out, whether you decide to publish a story or a news release or, hold a meeting or a town hall, consider who your audience is, and consider the purpose of the report. Are you trying to persuade someone of something, or are you just informing people who are going to be impacted by your decision? And that might change where you put your emphasis as you're thinking about your report out. And this is all just to kind of sum it up. So how solutions journalism can influence your newsroom. So you have to lay the foundations to invite conversations about labor and workers' rights in the newsroom, and think about what kind of stories you're publishing, create a pipeline so that there are ways to get ideas from your reporting to bubble up to decision makers, design a pilot so you're going about changes with intention, and then report out ultimately what you've learned and share your challenges and successes, because change can be contagious. And with that, I will stop my little presentation and I will open the floor for questions or just discussion.
Thanks, Ashton. We're having a chat about how puppies and pizza are nice, but don't actually solve problems. Does anyone have any questions for Ashton? I have a few, but would love to hear from others, or even just if anyone wants to share more about their experience working in a newsroom or organization and the challenges that they face. Well, I'll do a question. Oh, here's one. Have union members reached out to you about implementing in their own news orgs? Thanks, Sarah. Also, definitely understand you're on a deadline and can't be on camera.
Totally understand. Union members, no. I've gotten outreach from other leaders, actually, which is actually very heartening to see, other like newsroom leaders who are interested in figuring out how to make something like this work. I think they typically tend to come from smaller shops that maybe haven't been unionized, maybe just because of numbers, or the way that they're structured. But I also do wonder if, especially for something like a 4-day work week, with the really large places that have been unionized, so many of them are on that sort of daily 24-hour, 24/7 kind of grind, that might make it really difficult to enact a change like this. But I'm always hopeful that one day, like, the boss of whatever major TV network or major legacy newspaper will be like, hey, can we talk about how we can do this?
Are there any other workplace shifts that you have reported on that you're considering or that are kind of in the works?
Let's see. In the works right now, no, but previously, something like maternity leave, that's something that's been that we've reported on quite a bit, and we ultimately increased what we are offering in our policy most recently. I won't say the number of weeks because I don't know it off the top of my head. I think it's either 14 or 16. But yeah, that's another place where we kind of looked at the way we were reporting on an issue and took our kind of baseline understandings and said, okay, if this is what we understand to be kind of the gold standard in these other industries, how do we make that possible here? I think there's one more, which is maybe like unlimited sick leave, because I think that's something that we've reported on as well.
Did you do the same sort of like piloting for that? I mean, some of that feels like maybe a little bit less of a drastic change. There's long-standing policies like that, not everywhere, obviously.
Yeah. No pilots for those. It's hard to pilot maternity leave, especially with such a small team. But we've tried it one time and it worked great. So I think we're gonna stick with it. Oh, thank you, Jose. Please share with your leadership, share with everyone's leadership, tell everyone. Go shout it from the mountaintop.
And you mentioned one of the limitations was, Prism structure not necessarily being caught up in the 24-hour news cycle. Do you see how decreasing the number of hours people work a week at a 24-hour news cycle place could work? Like,
I think it might. Oh yeah, sorry.
I was just gonna say, even from like your initial pilot that was more cyclical and not everyone had the same days off, like with something like that, maybe.
I think that might have to be what it is. Yeah, I think it might be kind of staggered schedules where some people are Monday through Thursday, some people are Tuesday through Friday. And if it's the kind of place where you're literally like working through the weekend, then that might have to be accounted for as well. And maybe it requires more staff, but I don't think it actually, I mean, that's not what we found, right? We ended up being able to produce the same amount of stuff in one day less of time. So I think it's important for leaders in particular not to kind of overestimate the productivity impact or kind of misunderstand the productivity impact. People have been more productive from this 4-day work week. And I think that's something that kind of studies have been showing across the board in industries that have tried it.
Hi, Daniel. It's good to see you. So yeah, Ashton, Daniel is working in the Amazon in Brazil, and yeah, is starting to train a bunch of people in solutions journalism. And as Prism has been a part of SJN for a while now, a couple of different cohorts and trainings and programs, would love to hear your perspective of how you kind of start. Right. If that's your first step for implementing some of these policies is reporting on them, we have to start at solutions journalism. So yeah, what do you suggest people do to kind of really implement that into their newsroom?
I would say make use of SJN resources. SJN gives wonderful trainings and also just has a lot of really good resources on the website, particularly the solution story tracker. I really appreciate because it shows how many different ways there are to do solution stories. It's not the 4 pillars are the 4 pillars, but it's very much not a paint by numbers kind of practice in the way that they eventually show up in a story. So I would just say read a lot of solutions journalism and learn to recognize it when you're seeing it. And I think for us, honestly, it's something that we've often started doing without even like intending to do it. It just becomes a natural practice because ultimately what you're doing is sort of rigorous fact-based journalism where you're answering all of the natural questions where somebody says, hey, we're going to try this new thing out. And you're like, well, is it going to work? Have you tried it before? How did it work before? Were there any limitations? Can other people try it? So I think it's something that I think once you kind of get your feet wet with it, it really becomes a muscle that's easy to flex over and over again. And then at that point, it's very, very possible to kind of draw solutions from that into your own community or your own workplace. More questions?
I have one more. Yeah, you mentioned that your COO is the one who really kind of took this on. Explain a little bit more how, editorially and operations or HR or whatever that team is called within your organization can work together to make something like this happen. Often we're pretty separate. We like to be siloed.
So a lot of what operations did in this case was they sat down with, even before we decided to actually do the pilot, sat down with our newsroom leaders, our editorial director, and our features and news editor and said, is this even something that we can do? Is there a way for us to make this work? And at that point, kind of took a pause on it and took a moment and let our editorial team figure out what this could look like from our side of things. Operationally, it's not as obvious that everybody kind of needs to be on for 5 days, but with something like editorial, where we actually do find value in publishing stories 5 days a week, both for audience growth reasons and just to kind of increase the breadth of our coverage. We were thinking about how can we kind of keep that, but do so in a way that's not burning us out. So kind of giving editorial the space to figure out the logistics before we jumped into the pilot, I think was a really key piece of making it work.
And then on the other side of it too, I know you and I have talked about this as a nonprofit newsroom, as essentially a startup. You haven't been around too long. I can imagine this felt risky in some ways too, but you've also actually been able to fundraise off of this concept, correct?
Yes. Yeah. People are just generally very, very excited about it. So I think there have been a couple of like large gifts that have come in just as a result of this. And it also, because it's something we're doing that's relatively unusual, it's kind of raised our profile a little bit just and kind of put us in front of more eyeballs. So yeah, there have been a lot of kind of downstream benefits from it as well. So it's something that we're really happy to have been able to have done. And I'm really happy to just talk about it with anyone, truly.
Yeah, I did drop the here and now link in the chat at one point. All right. Well, any other questions? Anyone else want to come off mute or drop one in the chat? If you can't, I totally understand if your location doesn't allow you to talk. before we wrap up?
All right. Well, I will say, I mean this very sincerely. If anyone wants to talk to me about workplace stuff, 4-day work week stuff, please just reach right out. My email is ashton@prismreports.org. And you can also catch me on Twitter. I'm just at Ashton Lattimore. And yeah, of course, you can follow Prism's workers' rights coverage anytime at prismreports.org. But yeah, please get in touch. Please share this very widely. It just brings my heart so much joy when I see other places even start to think about implementing a change like this, because it's been so transformative for us. So yeah, if there's any way I can be helpful, please reach out.
Thanks, Ashton.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks everyone for coming.